When the firing stopped and the jungle fell silent, the war suddenly felt too quiet. The smell of burnt oil, gunpowder, and wet soil lingered in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. The Marines stood over the wreckage of the Japanese Hago tank they had just destroyed. The smoke curled from its thin armor, twisting upward, fading into the gray Pacific sky. Sergeant Miller stepped closer, brushing the soot from the tank's hull. "Damn thing looks like it's made of tin," he muttered. Private Collins, still gripping his smoking .50 cal, chuckled. "Guess the Japs didn't plan on meeting this beauty," he said, patting the heavy barrel with pride. The others laughed, but it was the uneasy kind of laughter that comes after a close call. When the hatch was finally pried open, the laughter stopped. Inside, the air was heavy and metallic, filled with smoke and the faint smell of fuel. There were two bodies. Young, small-framed Japanese soldiers, barely older than some of the Marines themselves. One still had a photograph clutched in his glove, the edges singed from the fire. A family portrait, a mother, a little girl, and a father in uniform. The Marines stared in silence. Collins swallowed hard. "He was just a kid," he whispered. No one said anything for a long time. The Hago, which moments ago had been nothing more than a target, now looked more like a tomb. The thin metal that had been mocked for its weakness had, in the end, trapped its crew inside. Sergeant Miller sighed, his tone softening. "They were soldiers, same as us," he said quietly, "fighting for their home, just like we are." War had a way of turning men into ghosts long before they died. For months, these Marines had been island hopping, from Tarawa to Guadalcanal, from one patch of hell to another. Each fight felt the same. Fire, noise, chaos, and then silence. But standing there, looking at the photo in that Japanese soldier's hand, something shifted. Later that night, around their campfire, the talk was different. No boasting, no jokes. Just quiet conversation and the distant hum of insects. Collins stared into the flames, his voice low. "You ever wonder if they thought the same about us?" he asked. "Maybe they saw us like monsters too." Miller nodded slowly. "Probably," he said, "and maybe they were just as scared." The next morning, they buried the two Japanese crewmen near the wreck of their tank. No ceremony, no words, just a rough wooden cross made from broken branches. One Marine stuck the photo beneath it, pressing it into the dirt. "So someone remembers them," he murmured. As they walked away, the Hago lay quiet, its rusting armor gleaming faintly in the morning sun. Birds had returned to the jungle, their songs almost too peaceful for such a place. The war would move on, another island, another battle. But for those Marines, that moment stayed. It became a reminder that behind every enemy uniform, there was a life, a family, a story. Years later, Miller would tell his grandson about that day. Not about the firefight or the kill count, but about the picture and how it changed the way he saw the war. "We thought we were the heroes," he'd say softly. "But out there, everyone was just trying to survive." And somewhere, deep in the jungle of the Pacific, the Hago still rested, rusted and overgrown with vines. Nature had claimed it as it always does. The laughter of the Marines, the roar of the .50 cal, the cries of the men inside, all gone now. Only silence remained. But if you listened closely, you could almost hear it, the echo of humanity in a place that once knew only war. The Pacific sun was merciless that morning. Heat shimmered off the jungle floor, and the air hung thick with humidity and gun smoke. The Marines had been fighting for days, pushing through Japanese resistance that seemed endless. Each ridge, each tree line, felt like another ambush waiting to happen. Their mission was simple on paper: capture the ridge, eliminate enemy armor, and secure the supply route. But the plan had gone wrong before it even started. High Command had underestimated the Japanese positions. Intelligence had reported light resistance, a few bunkers, maybe a single Hago tank. But what awaited them was a maze of camouflage defenses. well-dug machine gun nests, and more tanks than anyone expected. When the first shots rang out, the Marines were caught in the open. The Hago tanks, small and fast, emerged from the tree line like ghosts. Their 37mm cannons spat fire, forcing the Marines to dive into the dirt. "They were supposed to be out of ammo," someone shouted. But the truth was simple, the intelligence was wrong. Sergeant Miller slammed his fist into the ground, furious. "They knew we were coming," he growled. "We're walking straight into their line of fire." For hours, the firefight raged. The Hago tanks rolled forward, firing wildly. Their armor was thin, but their positioning was clever, using the jungle's cover and quick retreat paths. Each time the Marines tried to flank, they were pinned down by machine guns from hidden pillboxes. The radio crackled with confused orders. Units were mixed, casualties mounting. By noon, the air was thick with the sound of chaos. Shouting, gunfire, and the dull thump of mortars. Collins, sweating and covered in mud, crawled next to Miller. "Sir, the tanks aren't the problem," he said breathlessly. "It's the plan. We're out in the open. We should have waited for support." Miller knew he was right, but orders were orders. They couldn't pull back, not without leaving wounded behind. He looked across the field and saw one of the Hagos moving closer. Its turret turned slowly, like a hunter scanning for prey. "Get that .50 cal up," Miller shouted. Collins and another Marine scrambled, dragging the heavy machine gun into position. When the tank broke through the smoke, the .50 cal opened up. The heavy rounds tore through the Hago's armor as if it were paper. Flames erupted from its engine, and the small tank stopped, burning. For a moment, the Marines cheered, but the victory was hollow. That was only one tank. There were still more, and they were outnumbered. By the time the sun dipped low, the Marines had finally taken the ridge, but at a terrible cost. Dozens were dead, more wounded, and all because someone miles away had decided it would be an easy operation. That night, Miller sat by a small campfire, staring at a bloodied map. He replayed the day's chaos over and over in his mind. The tanks weren't the enemy that had beaten them, it was their own flawed strategy. "We walked right into it," he muttered bitterly. "They played us like fools." Collins sat beside him, silent. He looked at the stars through the smoke. "You think command will ever admit it was their fault?" he asked quietly. Miller didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone knew the answer. The next morning, orders came in, push forward again. Another assault, another hill, another minor resistance. The same mistake repeated, but this time Miller changed his approach. He ignored half the orders, sent scouts ahead, used captured Japanese maps to navigate. When they attacked, they came from an unexpected direction. This time, the Hagos were caught off guard. Within minutes, they were destroyed, their crews fleeing into the jungle. When the smoke cleared, Miller looked out over the field. "Now that," he said quietly, "is what should have been done from the start. War wasn't just about firepower, it was about judgment, about learning fast or dying faster. And the price of one bad decision was always paid in blood by the men on the ground." Years later, when historians wrote about the Pacific Campaign, that day barely made a footnote. Unexpected resistance encountered, objectives secured. But for the men who were there, it was burned into memory, the strategy mistake that cost lives, and taught them to trust their instincts over orders. Miller would tell his grandson years later, "We didn't win because we were stronger. We won because we stopped believing the papers and started thinking for ourselves." The war was full of errors, but this one, the mistake that led them into the open, became the lesson that saved many more lives afterward. And somewhere in that jungle, the burned-out shell of a Hago tank still sits under the trees, a silent witness to a battle that never should have happened the way it did. The jungle was eerily quiet after the gunfire stopped. The smell of burned metal, oil, and blood hung heavy in the humid air. For the Marines, Silence after battle was never peaceful. It was the sound of what was left behind. The last burst of machine gun fire had ended just 20 minutes earlier, but the memory of chaos still echoed in every man's head. Sergeant Daniel McAllister wiped the sweat from his eyes, streaking his dirt-covered face with ash. His squad had fought for nearly 5 hours against Japanese soldiers dug into the ridge overlooking the coast. The once green foliage was now shredded, the ground littered with broken helmets, empty shell casings, and torn maps. "All right, men," Mac called out, his voice hoarse. "Keep your eyes open. They like to play dead." Private Andrews, the youngest of the group, nodded but said nothing. His rifle trembled slightly in his hands. He had fired it more times today than in his entire training. The horror of what he saw around him, bodies twisted unnaturally, the lifeless eyes of men who had shouted moments before, was starting to settle in. Nearby, Corporal Ruiz was checking the Japanese positions. He moved cautiously among the craters and wrecked trees until he reached the remains of a Type 95 Hago tank. Its armor was riddled with holes from .50 caliber rounds, the small vehicle now little more than a burnt husk. The crew inside hadn't stood a chance. Ruiz stood silently for a moment. "They fought hard," he muttered. Mac joined him. "They always do." He looked at the shattered tank and then at the men moving through the clearing. War doesn't care who's right, just who's left. As medics began to move in, the Marines started gathering their fallen. There were 6 of their own who wouldn't be returning to camp. Each man was carefully lifted onto stretchers made of ponchos and bamboo poles. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the buzzing of flies and the distant rumble of the sea. Captain Harlow arrived a short while later, his uniform soaked with sweat. "Report," he demanded. Mac stood straight. "Ridge secured, sir. Heavy casualties on both sides. We found one of their officers. Looks like he took his own life before we reached him." Harlow nodded grimly. "Set up a perimeter. We'll hold until the next unit moves in." "And Mac," he paused, his eyes softening for a moment. "Good work out there. You did what had to be done." When the captain walked away, Mac stared down at his boots, caked with mud and blood. Did what had to be done. He wasn't sure those words meant much anymore. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, painting the battlefield in orange light, the Marines dug shallow graves for the enemy soldiers. It was a grim task, but it was part of the job. Mac watched as Ruiz gently placed a fallen Japanese soldier's helmet over the mound of earth. "He had a family too," Ruiz said quietly. "Yeah," Mac replied. "Somewhere out there, someone's waiting for a letter that'll never come." Night fell slowly, and with it came the chorus of insects and the distant croak of frogs. The Marines sat in a rough circle, eating cold rations under the dim glow of lanterns. The conversation drifted from the day's fight to home, New York, Texas, Iowa. Each man clinging to small memories of normal life. Andrews finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sergeant, do you think they felt fear? Like us?" Mac looked into the darkness for a long moment before answering. "Yeah, every one of them." Later, as most of the men slept, Mac walked back toward the ridge. The battlefield looked different now, softened by moonlight. The trees stood like silent witnesses, their branches heavy with smoke. He knelt beside one of the fallen Marines and placed a small cross made from 2 sticks into the ground. "You did good, kid," he murmured. From somewhere in the jungle came a faint rustle. Probably just a monkey or the wind, but Mac's hand went instinctively to his rifle. After a second, he relaxed. The fighting was over for now. But in the distance, faint flashes of light hinted that the war was still raging on another island. Another ridge, with another group of men doing the same thing he just did. The next morning, the Marines marched out, leaving behind only footprints and graves. The jungle would reclaim the land soon enough, covering the scars of battle with new growth. But for the men who fought there, the memories would never fade. As Mac led his squad down the muddy trail, he looked back one last time. Smoke still rose from the wreck of the Hago tank. The battle was done, but in that silent, broken landscape, he could almost hear the voices of both sides. Young, scared, determined, swallowed by the jungle once more. War, he thought, didn't end when the shooting stopped. It just changed shape. The morning sun burned through the haze over a small island in the Pacific. Waves rolled gently against the shore where, 80 years earlier, chaos and fire had once ruled. Now, only the rusting remains of that time lay hidden beneath vines and layers of earth. When the research team arrived, the island looked like paradise. Emerald jungle, golden sand, and a calm blue sky. But to historian Dr. Emily Carter, it was sacred ground. She wasn't there for beauty. She was there to uncover the ghosts of World War II. Her guide, an old fisherman named Sato, led her inland. "This place," he said in broken English, "used to shake from bombs. My grandfather told me. American Marines and Japanese soldiers, both brave, both scared." Emily nodded silently, stepping over tangled roots. They followed a narrow trail until the jungle opened into a clearing. There, half buried under moss and dirt, was the shape she'd been searching for, a Japanese Type 95 Hago light tank. Its turret was cracked, its treads broken, its steel scarred by bullet holes that had rusted into deep orange wounds. She crouched down, brushing away the soil with her gloved hand. "Here it is," she whispered. "The samurai armor of the Pacific." The Hago was a relic of another era, fast, lightly armed, and tragically outdated by the time it faced the Marines' .50 caliber machine guns. What had once been Japan's pride now lay forgotten, swallowed by nature. Her assistant, Mark, lifted a drone into the air to capture footage. "Hard to believe something this small was once called a tank," he said. Emily smiled faintly. It wasn't about size. It was about belief. The men inside thought they were invincible, until they met reality. They spent the day documenting the wreck. Inside the tank, they found the remains of rusted instruments, a cracked radio, and a few corroded shell casings. There were even faint traces of Japanese characters etched into the metal, maybe a name or a prayer. Emily took a deep breath. "Imagine sitting here," she said softly, her voice almost trembling. The air filled with smoke, engines screaming, bullets slamming through the armor, and knowing you couldn't escape. Mark looked uneasy. "Do you ever think about the men who were in these machines? I mean, really think about them, not as soldiers, but as people." "All the time," she replied. "That's why I'm here." Later, as the sun dipped low, they found a small, twisted metal plate under the tank's hull. It bore faint Japanese characters. Emily photographed it carefully and translated it using her tablet. "For the Emperor, never surrender." It sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just a weapon. It was someone's duty, someone's belief, someone's last stand. Back at camp that night, Emily sat beside a lantern, reading through letters written by Marines who fought in the same region. One line caught her eye. "We met their tanks today. Our .50 calories tore through them like paper, but those men didn't back down. I almost wish they had. Nobody should die that brave for something that lost." The next morning, a light rain began to fall, washing the jungle in silver mist. Emily and her team continued their excavation, careful not to disturb what remained inside the Hago. When they lifted the turret with a crane, they discovered something unexpected. A small, rusted tin box wedged between the seat and the floor. Inside was a photograph, faded almost to nothing. 3 young Japanese soldiers stood beside the same type of tank, smiling proudly. One of them might have been the driver of this very vehicle. Emily stared at it for a long time, her throat tight. "He was just a kid," she murmured. That photo would later become the centerpiece of her museum exhibit, Steel and Spirit, the Lost Machines of the Pacific. It told not just of war, but of humanity buried beneath metal and myth. Months later, when the Hago was finally transported to a military museum in Honolulu, crowds gathered to see it. Children pressed their faces to the glass, amazed by the old machine. Veterans stood silently, remembering. During the opening ceremony, Emily spoke briefly. Her voice was calm, steady, but filled with emotion. "This tank," she said, "was once a weapon of destruction. Today it's a teacher. It reminds us that courage, loyalty, and fear lived on both sides of every battlefield. History isn't about winners and losers. It's about people, all of them." As she stepped away from the microphone, she glanced back at the Hago. The tank, cleaned but not restored, still bore the scars of war. But in that museum light, it looked peaceful, almost dignified. Later that evening, when the hall was empty, Emily stood alone before the exhibit. She reached out, gently touching the cold metal through the glass. "Welcome home," she whispered. Outside, the rain had stopped. The Pacific shimmered under the moonlight, calm and eternal. The echoes of the past had finally found their place. Not in the ground, but in memory. Because sometimes, rediscovery isn't about what you dig up. It's about what you learn to see again, the humanity inside history's machines. The Hago tank was never the most powerful, nor the most feared, nor even the most successful weapon of the Second World War. Yet, decades after its final battle, its image still lingers, rusting quietly in jungles, sitting solemnly in museums, and haunting the memories of both American Marines and Japanese veterans who survived those desperate island fights. When historians talk about World War II armor, they mention the Sherman, the Tiger, the T-34, machines that define nations. But the Hago was different. It symbolized something more fragile, a nation's determination trapped inside outdated steel. In the early 1930s, Japan had seen the Hago as a marvel. It was light, fast, and perfectly suited for the warfare Japan expected: swift colonial campaigns through Asia. But by the time it faced the United States in the Pacific, that same design became its curse. Its thin armor could not stop even rifle fire at close range. When American .50 caliber rounds tore through it, the myth of Japan's invincibility began to crumble. After the war, most Hagos were left behind, burned out, abandoned, or swallowed by the jungle. Yet a few survived long enough to tell their silent story. One of them rests today on the island of Guam, its hull still pitted with bullet holes. Veterans occasionally visit, standing before it in quiet reflection. One Marine who fought there in 1944 once told a reporter, "I remember the first time we saw one of these. We laughed. It looked like a toy. But then it fired back, and we stopped laughing." That moment captures the strange legacy of the Hago, a weapon that earned both ridicule and respect. In Japan, the Hago became a reminder of misplaced confidence, of how military pride had blinded the empire to its technological weaknesses. Japanese historians describe it as a samurai in an age of guns. Brave, loyal, but tragically obsolete. In America, it became a symbol of how quickly warfare evolves. The Marines learned that victory didn't come from superior numbers alone, but from adapting, from understanding the enemy's tools, tactics, and mistakes. The .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun, once designed for aircraft and fortifications, became the perfect tank killer for the Pacific. But perhaps the deepest legacy of the Hago lies not in steel or firepower, but in memory. When a rusted Hago was unearthed in the Philippines in 2016, local villagers gathered to watch as archaeologists pulled it from the mud. Many had grown up hearing stories from grandparents about the little Japanese tank. For them, it wasn't just a relic. It was living proof that their island had once stood at the crossroads of history. Inside the tank, the team found a helmet, a small notebook with faded Japanese script, and a single bullet lodged deep in the armor plate. The notebook was later translated. It contained brief, almost childlike notes. "The sea is beautiful today. We must protect the island." That single line moved thousands when it was published online. It reminded people that even in war, especially in war, humanity never disappears completely. In Tokyo's Yasukuni Museum, another Hago stands restored. Its paint is fresh, but its scars remain visible beneath the surface. Visitors often walk past it quickly, drawn instead to the more famous Zero fighter planes or the massive artillery guns. Yet those who stop and look closer often feel something deeper, a quiet sadness. The Hago doesn't boast of victory. It simply exists, as if whispering, "Remember me not for what I destroyed, but for what I represent." Back in the Pacific, time continues to reclaim what was once steel and fire. Vines crawl over the remaining Hagos, roots pierce through their hulls, and rain slowly erases the last traces of war. But the legacy survives, in photographs, diaries, documentaries, and stories like this one. For the Marines, the Hago taught that no enemy should ever be underestimated. For the Japanese, it became a lesson in humility and the cost of clinging to tradition. For historians, it is a symbol of transition, from the old ways of war to the mechanized brutality of the modern age. And for those who stumble upon one today, deep in the jungles of Saipan or the beaches of Peleliu, it's a haunting reminder that every piece of metal once carried men, hope, and fear. Decades later, a Hago turret sits quietly at a military museum in Hawaii. A small plaque beneath it reads, "Recovered from Guam, 1944, the Japanese Type 95 Hago light tank. Fast, fragile, and fearless." A group of schoolchildren stands before it. One boy asks his teacher, "Did people really fight in that?" The teacher nods. "Yes, they fought, they believed, and they died in it." The boy frowns, thinking, then says softly, "It looks too small to hold a war." And maybe that's the truth of the Hago's legacy. It was too small for the battles it faced, for the hopes it carried, and for the empire it tried to defend. Yet, in its smallness, it tells the entire story of human war. Courage and futility, invention and ignorance, destruction and remembrance. The Hago's engine has long been silent, but its story of pride, of loss, and of the people inside continues to echo across time, because history doesn't always remember the strongest machines. Sometimes it remembers the ones that failed and what those failures taught us.